this has to begin for me with an understanding of ecological dynamics. And then we're going to look specifically at how we can give feedback in a way which aligns with the concepts of the constraint-led approach underpinned by ecological dynamics. But obviously, firstly, we have to understand what ecological dynamics is. So the key thing here is that ecological dynamics, it's a framework for kind of day-to-day life and how us as humans can interact with we walk our dog down the street, where we're going for coffee in the morning, driving the car. Everything that we do in our day-to-day life is basically underpinned by these ideas. And then obviously, especially when we're playing a complex sport such as basketball. So what is it? Well, ecological dynamics comes from two different roots, so to speak, and that's where its name originates from. So we've got dynamic systems theory on the left, hence the latter part of the name ecological dynamics, and then ecological psychology. So, and this, I'd say, this is stuff which was done not specifically by sport-specific researchers, but like I said, psychologists working in different fields. And then when the constraint-led approach emerged in the early 2000s, they were actually taking these ideas of ecological dynamics and applying it specifically to sport coaching, right? And we're going to get into that on the next slide. So essentially, dynamic systems theory is the idea that movements are self-organizing, and that's a key part of it. So there is no such thing as us as human beings having stored motor programs in our brain for moving a particular way. So obviously, as that translates to basketball, we don't have like a coding in our brain for how to shoot a basketball, how to do a jump stop, how to form a chest pass. Every movement that we do to execute a particular technique in a game self-organizes each situation as a result of the interacting constraints, which we're going to look at on the next slide. And another key part of dynamic systems theory is the fact that there are different rates of learning. And that's something very important to remember when we get on to the feedback piece in just a moment. So that's our dynamic systems theory. Key thing, movement is self-organizing. Ecological psychology, a lot of this work comes from a guy called Gibson, who was very prolific in the 1960s. And this is the theory. This is the theory for how animals and their environment interact. So obviously animals, that includes humans too. And the key thing here that Gibson spoke about is the idea of an affordance. And an affordance is an opportunity for action. So in basketball, every time we're playing the game, whether it's a practice or a game, every basketball possession, players can act or not act upon affordances based on their ability to perceive information in their environment. So for instance, let's say the ball is on the left 45 and it's a pick and roll situation. And let's say the ball handler, he sees that his defender is out of position, giving him an opportunity to reject the pick and get to the rim. So that's an affordance, okay? So he or she acts upon that affordance to reject. Whereas maybe in another situation, same situation, the player doesn't attend to that specific information. They don't see it. And so they miss that opportunity. They miss the ability to act on that affordance because they're not able to perceive that information. And this is obviously why it's so important in our practices to coach us small-sided games, etc., so that we actually recreate the same affordances that players encounter in a game in practice. So when you hear me talk about an affordance today, that's what it means, an opportunity for action, okay? Defensively, offensively, whatever. And obviously how feedback relates to that, you can imagine it's very important. Last part of ecological psychology is just simply the idea of perception and action coupling. We perceive to act and we act to perceive. So every time in a game, in life or in basketball, we're constantly going through this perception action coupling process. So in games, players are constantly moving their head to take in new information in their environment. And then whatever information they see, they might act on that information. So for instance, maybe I read down the ball in transition and immediately I start looking up the floor. As I'm dribbling, I see an open space to keep dribbling forwards. That's an affordance. I'm acting on that affordance to use the space. And then maybe I see a teammate ahead of me in space. Okay, I've perceived that information. Then I act by passing the ball. I act on that affordance. That's the essence of perception action coupling, a continuous process in basketball. So there's no such thing as just the action. And, how this relates to the constraint-led approach, well, the constraint-led approach is underpinned by ecological dynamics if we're doing it the right way. So, whether we're doing it or not, coaches coach with constraints naturally, okay, in their practices, because everything that happens in terms of skills, emerging, and movement solutions is a result of these different constraints. And this is Neuro's constraints model. So we got individual task environments. So the idea is when we combine the perception and action coupling process we just looked at, and we add in the presence of constraints, so individual things related to the performer, things like their size, their wingspan, fatigue level, weight. And then we blend in task constraints, things like how much time is on the clock, the spacing, location of defense, location of teammates. This is what leads to the movement solutions and skills emerging. Okay, so the idea is this constraint-led approach it takes the ideas of ecological dynamics and adapts it specifically to sport. So for us as basketball coaches, it gives us a very solid framework for understanding how we can coach in a way which aligns with the evidence and the research which exists in terms of how players can adapt and perform. So now in terms of, I don't use the word skill acquisition anymore, because skill acquisition kind of implies that we're acquiring all these techniques. Instead, for me, it's skill adaptation. Okay, so with this constraint-led approach, it's to develop skilled players. How can we get them to perceive as much information as possible in their environment, and then be able to adapt to every situation with several different functional movement solutions, aka skills. All right. Now, this is critical because we can't give feedback without understanding the constraint-led approach. Okay, because giving feedback when we understand the constraint-led approach would be very difficult to giving feedback when we use the traditional information processing approach. That being an approach whereby coaches focus mostly on teaching techniques first, complexity and decisions later. Okay, so obviously with the constraint-led approach, we do not do that, because everything we do in practice, perception and action coupling is integrated into everything we do. Okay, so the challenge and the complexity is first. So players are continuously learning through all these different small-sided games, okay, with different task constraints, etc. Do we have any questions on this part before I begin? Anything that maybe isn't clear to you coaches on the constraint-led approach that I could help with just before we move on and immediately get into the feedback?
A thought jumped into my head, Alex.
Absolutely, Luke.
What's the difference between an affordance and a cue? And is there a difference?
Okay, great point. So for me, I'm not really using the idea of a cue anymore, because for me, it's a little bit too maybe artificial is the word, right? So for me, an affordance for me, there are several different ways that players can act upon affordance, right? And I think the problem with a cue is sometimes we insist that players can only do one thing. Let me give you an example of that. Let's say we're going under on a pick and roll, okay? For a lot of coaches, they would say, all right, that has to be the cue for you to shoot, right? But for individual constraints, every player is different. So for some players, it might make no sense whatsoever to do that, because maybe they're so fast and explosive, they can just downhill the under and beat them with a burst of speed. Or maybe we're not a good shooter and they have to play off the twist, aka the rescreen. So for me, I'm not so much really using the word cues anymore. I'm more, and I don't really use the word affordance with players, because they don't need to know what it is, but they have to be attuned to affordances. Okay. And for instance, in a pick and roll, they have to be aware of all the different solutions that could emerge. In finishing, they have to be attuned to all the different opportunities to act in a finish, right? But for me, that's where knowledge in the game is more important than knowing and being able to talk about things. So for me, there's a big difference between the knowledge in and the knowledge of. Now, I still am a big believer in players being able to use a terminology. I'm going to talk about that, and be able to, be attuned to the right things. Because for me, when you use that terminology from this perspective, what you're doing is you're placing their attention on specific affordances, if that makes sense. But for me, it's most important that then they can act upon it and show and demonstrate that within the small-sided games.